Can America unite? Can America move past its political polarization? That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt. And I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. America is polarized, right? That's speaking the obvious. But can America unite? Can America truly, in this vicious political climate, become that great melting pot that we're supposed to be? Before I get into all that, I want to give a quick heads up that if you like Bold and Blunt, you can get Bold and Blunt at edify.app. That's the online platform to go to if you're interested in faith-based podcasts, and I'm happy to say that Bold and Blunt is among its lineup. You can also get Bold and Blunt at washingtontimes.com or wherever podcasts are offered. Listen to this. This is from Pew Research. It was written in November 2021, so it's still fairly recent. Partisan polarization remains the dominant, seemingly unalterable condition of American politics. That's how this essay opens. Republicans and Democrats agree on very little, and when they do, it often is in the shared belief that they have little in common. What do you think about that? Do you have anything in common with those who hold opposing political views than you? If you're a Republican, do you find common ground frequently today with Democrats? If you're a Democrat, which, to be honest, if you're a Democrat, I would be surprised you're even listening to Bold and Blunt right now, because it contains probably so many differences, politically speaking and culturally speaking, that you and your party represent. But if you happen to be listening and you're a Democrat, do you find common ground these days with your Republican colleagues? I don't find hardly anything in common with Democrats these days. And I say that with a family that's steeped in Democrat politics and coming from an area of the nation where it's dominated by Democrat politicians and politics. Back to Pew. Yet, the gulf that separates Republicans and Democrats sometimes obscures the divisions and diversity of views that exist within both partisan coalitions, and the fact that many Americans do not fit easily into either one. Actually, I take that as a note of optimism, that Americans aren't easily fit into a box of Democrat versus Republican, that there are more nuances out there, because that gives me hope that there are a lot more critical thinkers than just political hacks, right? That's a good thing. That's a good thing that in America we don't have just two types of people, Democrats and Republicans. Okay, back to this Pew finding, back to this Pew research. Republicans are divided on some principles long associated with the GOP: an affinity for businesses and corporations, support for low taxes, and opposition to abortion. Democrats face substantial internal differences as well, some that are long-standing, such as on the importance of religion in society, others more recent. For example, while Democrats widely share the goal of combating racial inequality in the United States, they differ on whether systemic change is required to achieve that goal. Well, here's the thing. Republicans are divided these days on business and corporate support because corporations that have long taken advantage of the free market and capitalistic system that Republicans support in this nation have now gone woke. They've gone to the dark side. They've sided with the social justice warrior segment of the Democrat Party. So of course there's going to be split among conservatives versus Republicans. There's a difference there. And Democrats, if Democrats really do differ on their views of what Pew gave as an example of racial inequality in the United States, where some say it's systemic and others just say it's spotty, where are the ones that don't think it's systemic? You don't hear much from those Democrats. You don't hear a lot of Democrats in the Democrat Party coming out and railing in the media against the Democrat platform that believes the Constitution is a document that advances racism because it was written by founding fathers, some of whom had slaves. You don't hear Democrats railing against that systemic racism argument. So how do you find common ground on that? I mean, that's just a small, teeny example of differences that are separating not just Republicans and Democrats, but conservatives in the Republican Party and I would say maybe liberals in the Democrat Party. But the liberals in the Democrat Party, the libertarian classical liberals, aren't speaking out against what the lunatic fringe in the Democrat Party is advocating these days. So again, the bigger question is how to find unity. Are we doomed in America to this harsh, sometimes vicious, sometimes violent political polarization? Well, in his first speeches, as a matter of fact, as president-elect, Joe Biden promised to bridge these political and cultural differences in America. I don't think he's done much to accomplish on that score, but really, it's no surprise. In November 2020, Pew, in a different piece, wrote this: America is exceptional in the nature of its political divide. It will be a difficult struggle, Pew wrote, in regards to Joe Biden's promise to unite the nation. Americans have rarely been as polarized as they are today. The studies we've conducted at Pew Research over the past few years illustrate the increasingly stark disagreement between Democrats and Republicans on the economy, racial justice, climate change, law enforcement, international engagement, and a long list of other issues. Pew goes on to write, the 2020 presidential election further highlighted these deep-seated divides. Supporters of Biden and Donald Trump believe the differences between them are about more than just politics and policies. A month before the election, roughly 8 in 10 registered voters in both camps said their differences with the other side were about core American values, and roughly 9 in 10, again in both camps, worried that a victory by the other would lead to lasting harm to the United States. So what does that mean? It means it's going to be very difficult to bridge the divide that's in America right now. It's way beyond just politics. It's way beyond just policies, as Pew pointed out in its research. It's about values. It's about a moral compass. It's about the actual direction of America beyond just the political world, beyond just the next election. And if we can't agree on common values, what can we agree on? It's a vicious political atmosphere out there, and I think part of the problem is that it's very difficult to look past these differences and see the humanness in those that we disagree with politically. It's very difficult to look at a Democrat who splashes red paint on her white pants and goes to protest in the streets in front of a Supreme Court justice's home over a ruling on Roe v. Wade that she disagrees with and screams obscenities at these justices. It's very difficult to look at that individual and go beyond the politics and policies that she's screaming about and see the common values there that we can all embrace as members of the same human class. It's very difficult to find the humanity in situations like that and find the common ground that unites, not divides. But so be it. That's the political atmosphere right now. And whether or not we can bridge these divides is a big question going forward. And I have a guest today who actually has some thoughts on these very issues. His name is Sean Spicer. He is the former communications director and former White House press secretary under President Donald Trump. He hosts the widely popular, widely successful Newsmax TV show, Spicer and Company, with his co-host, Lindsay Keith. He is a best-selling author, and he has a new podcast out that actually could unite many people in America who are right now bickering over political differences. Sean Spicer, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. I really appreciate your time.
Of course, Cheryl. Always good to be with you.
So we went in just a few short months between Donald Trump and Joe Biden from an America First to America Last. And you warned about this in Radical Nation, your 2021 bestseller, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's Dangerous Plan for America. What's in store next, do you think?
You know, the funny thing is, a lot of it was, when I wrote the book, I had seen the first 6 months, and I was saying, okay, based on the confirmation hearing, based off the initial policies and the executive orders and the pronunciations and the people they were proposing, here's what I believe. And it's sort of like, in a way, you kind of hope that you're wrong, or that maybe things that, I think that, like, there should be, I'm going to make a pitch to the publisher, and you and I share a publisher, so hopefully you can help on this, called the Radical Nation 2, even more radical. Instead of, like, you would think at some point when inflation hits over 8% and gas is over $5 a gallon, like, you kind of do the Bill Clinton route, and you say, okay, let's triangulate. We're going into midterm. Maybe we could do something different. Instead, they go, let's double down. I've been in politics almost 30 years. I've never seen anything like this.
Right.
Just think about it. Like, imagine it's baseball season. Imagine you're going into the fifth inning and your pitcher has given up 30 runs. And you've got, 10 other pitchers. And the manager looks over and says, let's keep them in.
Yeah.
You would be like, no, let's put in anybody else because you can't get worse. And yet they double down on all these policies and people. And that's frankly what Radical Nation was all about. It's kind of like detailing this and saying, here are these people, here are the policies, and here are their lack of qualifications, and kind of explaining why they are who they are and why they're doing what they're doing. I literally have a whole thing on Roe. And it was fortuitous that we got the ruling that we did, because I explained Joe Biden's entire history with being pro-life and talking about how Roe was wrongly decided.
Well, I'm glad you kind of jumped right in where I wanted to go with this interview, getting right to the meat of it. Look, everything you say is absolutely true. And I think most sane Americans agree with what you say about you couldn't have picked a better president if you wanted to completely dismantle America. So the big question here is, what's the end game? Why? Is it just evil?
I actually make a case in Radical Nation that it's legacy. And so hear me out. So what I believe is this. If you're a normal president, or frankly a normal politician, even like a governor or something, your legacy is defined by like how many, unemployment or how many jobs you created, or I put this bridge up. What Joe Biden wants to say is the following. And that's not want to say, he does say it. I appointed the first black woman to be vice president. I appointed the first LGBTQIA plus 6, whatever the current thing is.
Right.
To head a department. I appointed the first sports star to lead I'm trying to remember what she is, because she's not. It's the public health service. So it's not. It's a service, but it's not she heads the public service anyway. But he wants to be able to say all these things that don't have to do, that are virtue signaling to the left, but it has nothing to do with accomplishment. It has to do with like bullet points and points on the board for the left. That going forward from now on, when a Democrat gets elected, they're going to say, well, Joe Biden appointed the first female. What are you going to do? And I appointed the first black woman to the Supreme Court. So now, what are you going to do? And so he, no matter what else happens, right, he literally has to do nothing else. As far as the left is concerned, and he can say he is now the gold star for the left as far as appointments go, and that's all he wanted. And that's the thing that people have to keep in mind, because when you say to yourself, why would anyone want to, frankly, suck so much?
Right.
That's why, because the metric isn't success in the traditional sense.
But don't you think you and I both have been in politics or watching politics or in the media for a long time. And don't you feel that there's something different about the atmosphere in America today than in past decades? It seems almost as if it's beyond just political disagreements. There's a very decided globalist approach to what's taking place in America right now. And that's a bigger peril, don't you think?
Well, I think that the lines have become a lot clearer, and I think, in my opinion, and I go back to what I argue is this, because I get what you're saying in terms of the globalization of it, but I also believe that people on the right finally feel free to fight, in the sense that for the longest time, I don't know, and maybe you disagree with this, it's just I've always believed that people on the right are apologetic. When we fight for life, we're always like, but we respect the other side. We respect if you're pro-choice. We respect that. And there's and what Trump sort of did by giving sort of this, for lack of a better word, middle finger or two words to the left, was to say, I'm not going to apologize for thinking that you people are not good people, right? A lot of folks in the left and in the media, and he was unapologetically, America first. And I think that whether or not you agreed with every tactic or style or policy, I think people on the right went like, okay. And it was just a different way. I don't know. For the first time, I always felt like since college, I always felt sheepish about, I was like, okay, I know I'm pro-life. I know I'm, what I'm for. But I always tell this story, Cheryl, and I hope you'll indulge me for a second, but I was the assistant U.S. trade rep under George Bush. And so there's always talk about renegotiating trade deals, and everyone always said you can't renegotiate these trade deals because, they were negotiated. They're what we call in force is the legal word. And then Trump came along, and he was like, why not? And I was like, well, because, they're in force and da-da-da. And he was like, okay, but they're bad deals. They're not good for the American worker, so why would we just sit back and allow that to happen? And you scratch your head and you think for a second, you've got a point there. Why would we? And that was Donald Trump, is to say to himself, wait a second, so you guys literally aren't going to do anything, that would help America or American workers because a trade deal's in force? Like in business, we would never do that. We would renegotiate. And there was something uniquely refreshing about a businessman's mindset that said, a bad deal is a bad deal. Just renegotiate it. And I think that this ability to fight for what you believe in and to fight for conservative principles is something that really has come into its own in the last little while. And what has happened is when people say, oh my God, everything changed, in 94 I was on the Hill when Gingrich and everybody took over. And everyone goes, oh, everything changed. And I said, yeah, of course it changed, because prior to that, the Republicans had been in the minority for so long. They used to just, they'd wake up and the deal was they'd get a third of everything. So the minority would just get a third of the appropriations process. They get a third of the committee seats. And they were fat and happy. They were like, okay, we don't have to do anything. We show up, we get our third, we don't really have to do any work. Okay, not a bad deal. And suddenly, and the media would sort of play the game. And suddenly I think Republicans realized, hey, we can fight and win and actually enact policies. And that just changed the dynamic in a way that no one had ever seen.
You make a lot of interesting points there, and I guess the one point I'd like to bring up is that I agree with you that the conservative side has been rather reluctant to get in the mud with the Democrats, where Democrats largely live nowadays, and part of the point I wanted to bring out was, you remember Ann Coulter, when Ann Coulter was a street fighter, and the conservatives, even Republicans, detested, or a lot of Republicans detested how she fought. But that's sort of how Donald Trump fought as well. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think she was at the forefront of a lot of this, and I think, again, the difference with Ann, I would argue to some extent, is that Anne was a pundit and therefore couldn't really affect change, right? And so she could be incendiary and know that she didn't really, or not that know that she couldn't, but she couldn't then affect any change. So she could say something about policy or whatever, and nothing would happen. I think with Trump, he could say something and be like, okay, and then I'm going to do it.
Of
and
course.
I think that made a huge difference because people were like, wow, this guy's actually going to then follow up and do what he said. And that had never happened before. Also, when Aaron sort of was coming up in the 90s and cable was ascent at the same time, and, that was sort of, it was very new. Everything about that was new.
So going forward, do you think that we can return to a day where Republicans and Democrats can agree to disagree and politely go back to politicking for the American people? Or do you see going forward that this vicious political atmosphere is just going to continue?
It's a fascinating question. I think some people can. I have a lot of friends that can. But I don't. I think it's going to be a while, particularly because of this. And I've written about this extensively in actually all three of my books. But the left controls all institutions. They control like television. They control academia. They control government. They control the media writ large. They control you name it, K through 12, higher ed, right? So they. And so when you control everything, think about all the wokeness that's going on in big government right now in terms of, and so when right now, there is not every government, every major corporation is coming out saying, we're going to drive you to get an abortion. There's not a company that's coming out and saying, we're going to pay for you to help get an adoption. What's going on? So my point is that until anybody sees the other side, it's just fascinating to me because we are living in a very one-sided world. And I think until we have a world that recognizes both sides, I think that's part of the problem is that we're living in a world where everybody wants to say we should be tolerant of the other side, except I don't believe that the right deserves to be heard. That's what it comes down to. College campuses are like, we want to be tolerant, we just don't want any conservative speakers.
I find it very difficult as a conservative to be tolerant of Democrats because what I see, and you know what, you probably have a lot more insider info on this than I do. You probably have Democrat friends. But what I see is the Democrat Party is just filled with wicked people who would do anything to score political wins. Abortion, transgenderism, LGBTQ agenda, exploiting kids. And I find that very difficult to be tolerant of.
Well, I think the funny part is so many of these people that I notice. It's funny. I actually think that in most cases that I think that they are misled, ignorant. It's just when you have conversations with a lot of folks about issues, whether it's the economy or abortion, whatever. In all honesty, a lot of times I'll have a conversation and I'll make a point, and then you'll bring up an issue of common sense in terms of the consequence of their actions or something like that, and they'll say yeah, but, and it's no, not but,
exactly.
That's the issue, and they just, I think that they are brainwashed by so many folks on the left as far as what to believe.
I think you're right. And my family is really hardcore Democrat from Massachusetts. So I get a little inside info about their way of thinking. And you're right. They too easily dismiss the basic points in favor of their wills and agendas. And I know our time grows tight right now. So I did want to sidestep to this new podcast that you have coming out. Can you tell listeners a little bit about it?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It's called Beyond the Briefing. The idea is similar to the conversation that you and I are having, but focused on the person. And the idea is this. I have a show, Spicer & Company, at 5 o'clock every night on Newsmax. You've been on it several times, and it's always great to have you on.
Thank you.
But as you know, the segments are 5 or 7 minutes, and they're usually about a topic that, or one of the books that you have out. And you don't get to talk to the person. And so many times when I get off air, I'll be like, what's so interesting is I'll read the person's bio and I'll be like, wow, that person's really interesting. And a lot of times they're in politics and, whatever. I'm like, it's so interesting how they got so successful or how they got to where they are or whatever. And so beyond the briefing is an idea that for 20, 25 minutes we talk about beyond who they are. And the reason I called it beyond the briefing is when I was at the White House, everybody knew who I was because of the briefing, but they didn't know there was much more of me beyond the briefing, who I was as an individual. And so I was like, whenever I do these speeches after I left the White House, I'd be like, well, there's a lot to know about me beyond the briefing. So I thought, and then of course my first book was The Briefing because it was about who I was. So the idea is to have these conversations, once or twice a week with people that I think are interesting. They're not all politicians. Sometimes it's entertainment folks that I've gotten to know, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, they're again, all different backgrounds. And the idea is just to get, like I said, beyond the briefing and find out who somebody is, what they believe, how they got successful, what makes them tick. I mean, and some of it's light and funny. So it's, we've got an aspect of the show or of the podcast where we sort of really try to get to know the individual as a person. And, again, I think there's just so much where I've had these conversations with people over the last 5 years, and we'll be in the middle of dinner or drink or something, and they'll start telling me a story, and I'm like, no way. And it's just, it's that break that somebody got, that job that they had, that experience, the something about their childhood or whatever. And I've always kind of, I'll regale, maybe I'll tell that story to a group of friends at some point. I'll think, when I was with so-and-so, you would never believe what they told me. And I finally started to think, I've got this really good collection of individuals that I've gotten to meet over the last 5 or 10 years who've shared some pretty amazing stories. I should start to have them on a podcast to tell those stories. And that's it. It's just because I like I said, after 5 or 7 minutes of a TV show, you can't then stop. I'm interviewing the president of Guatemala. We're going to talk a lot about the root cause of immigration, right? Which is what Kamala Harris should be doing.
Right.
But he's such a fascinating man. He ran for president 3 times before and lost all 3 times, and then founded his own party, then ran and came in second, and it wasn't until the runoff that he won the 4th time. And I'm thinking, this is a guy that you're like, how do you stay that focused? I mean, like, you lose 3 times. On the 4th time, you found your own political party. You go to the election. You come in second place, and I'm not talking a close second. He lost by more than half, right? But because he got second place, he got into the runoff. And then he ended up winning by big time. And so it's just, like, I was like, God, that's got to be fascinating. So, anyway, I thought about this. I'm not going to, obviously, we're not going to be able to get him on the podcast. But I looked at an individual like that, and I said, that's the kind of guy that I want.
That is really interesting. It's kind of like talking with you about politics and then finding out you were on Dancing with the Stars. I mean, it's stories like that.
But the funny thing, Cheryl, is there's so many times when people will say to me, tell me how you ended up on that show. And again, for me, it's my life, so I don't necessarily, but for a lot of times, I mean, it is kind of a fascinating thing. I won't bore you with the story, but the bottom line is, how does this kid from Rhode Island, you and I grew up not that far apart, not only end up in the White House, but then end up on a reality show, and a guy who can't dance is up in the quarterfinals. I was like, but there's these stories that I'm always like, and I was just a curious kid, always growing up. Whenever I started on Capitol Hill, and I bumped into somebody, right, I'd be like, so tell me, how did you get your job? How did you get here? Because I was always fascinated by how do I do that? And so, anyway, I just, like I said, I have had a fascination with people and how they ascended and how they got there, and I want to, kind of start having these conversations now.
Well, your passion is infectious, and really, a show like you describe, a show like you're hosting, that is exactly what our nation needs to unite, not divide. And so I applaud you for taking that on. And Sean, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. Your book, Radical Nation, is amazing, and I do hope you bring your second Radical Nation to fruition. It'll be an interesting read.
Okay. Well, Cheryl, thanks for having me on your podcast. It's always a pleasure having you on Spicer & Company on Newsway.
Thank you. He is such an interesting guy. And if you want to find out more about Sean Spicer, go to seanspicer.com. You can sign up for his newsletter, join his email list. You can keep track of all his upcoming media appearances, check out his books, his titles, the endorsements, and so forth. And of course, you can check out his new podcast, which I'm going to do today, and I hope you do too as well. And if you like Bold and Blunt as a podcast, don't forget you can get it at edify.app. You can also get it at Washington Times or wherever podcasts are offered. And one more quick mention. Check out my latest book. It's called Lockdown, The Socialist Plan to Take Away Your Freedom. You can get it at cherylchumley.com or Barnes & Noble Books A Million, Amazon, wherever books are offered. And I might add, these are the same places where you can pick up your copy of Sean Spicer's latest Radical Nation. Thank you for listening. Tune in next time. And in the meanwhile, stay blunt, stay bold.